Argentina ha venido creciendo a una tasa promedio del 8% anual, ¿no? Ya hace esto unos años. ¿Cuál cree que son las fortalezas y las debilidades de este modelo económico que podría definirse como heterodoxo, ¿no?
Well, the big strength, I think, especially during the last expansion, was the heterodox policy of what we call targeting, having the central bank target a stable and competitive real exchange rate. That was very important. It's very, very important. And the commitment of the government to growth. You know, that is why China grows as fast as it does, because the government has a commitment. They did not go into recession last year like most of the world. So I think that is the strength. In terms of the weakness, the problem is, of course, that if you have inflation that is higher than the inflation of your trading partners, the inflation itself is not a problem. That's another thing that the media gets wrong. It's not the inflation itself that is the problem. But what happens is the inflation over time affects the exchange rate and in real terms, and that makes the country less competitive internationally. So that is a problem that has to be resolved, but it is not an urgent problem, and it is not the inflation itself. It is the influence of inflation on the real exchange rate.
Ahora, esta misma ortodoxia dice que, por ejemplo, la inflación está generada por la política monetaria, y desde la heterodoxia se dice que tiene que ver más con un problema estructural, ya que estamos en una economía muy concentrada, que hay mucho monopolio, hay mucho oligopolio. ¿Con cuál de los dos conceptos coincide, Mark?
No, I think the heterodox approach is clearly correct. I mean, economists have known for many years that there's no real relationship between the money supply growth and inflation. It is really only the IMF and a few others that and a lot of central bankers that still believe in those ideas.
Se habla también desde el Cono Sur que se podría estar yendo hacia un socialismo del siglo XXI, ¿no? Ante el fracaso del socialismo del siglo XX, digamos. ¿Qué se entiende o qué se pretende decir con socialismo del siglo XXI? Es decir, ¿en qué concepción desde lo económico se podría ubicar?
Well, in my opinion, I think that what you're seeing in Latin America is a form of social democracy. And I think the reason that the left does not use those terms is because social democracy in Venezuela, for example, was very discredited. It did not reach down to the majority of the population. The poor were excluded before Chavez. Mm-hmm. And so now what you have is more of a social democracy. Even in Venezuela, if you take that as an example of the most left of the new left governments, if you look at all the nationalizations that have taken place in Venezuela, it is outside of oil, it's not even 2% of GDP, you know, it's not that much. The economy, in fact, for most of the last decade in Venezuela, the private sector has grown faster than the public sector. Mm-hmm. Really until last year or so this was true. And so I think that it is a form of social democracy. It's countries taking control of their national resources. It's basically reversing some of the horribly destructive neoliberal reforms that you had, for example, in Argentina in the 1990s. Look what they did to this country. I mean, it was practically destroyed the economy from 1998 to 2002. And so what these governments are doing is they're looking for new ways to make the economy work after a long, long failure. I think most people don't realize this, but the failure of neoliberalism from 1980 to all the way to through the 2000s, most of the 2000s, is something you haven't had here for more than 100 years. Just to give you an example, From 1960 to 1980, income per person in Latin America, which is the most basic measure that economists have of economic progress, income per person grew from 1960 to 1980 by 82%. From 1980 to 2000, it grew by 9%, which is nothing. So a whole generation and a half lost any chance to improve their living standards. Again, this really is very unusual in the whole history of capitalism. So this is why you have all of these left of center governments now looking for different economic policy, because there was an unprecedented long-term economic failure.
Muy bien. ¿Querés hacerle alguna pregunta, Jorge?
Sí, solamente porque siendo que Mark es un economista, de los pocos economistas que sigue América Latina, pero no solo sigue América Latina, sino tiene una posición a favor de los procesos de cambio de la América Latina. La pregunta es, ¿por qué se deforma tanto la imagen de los procesos populares en América Latina en relación a la opinión pública, pero también la opinión progresista norteamericana? ¿Por qué existe tanta distorsión respecto al miedo de América Latina?
Well, the problem in the United States is that we don't have, on foreign policy issues, we don't have an independent civil society that is recognized by the media. So in other words, everyone you see on television or hear on the radio, or almost everyone, is either a government official when it comes to foreign policy. They're either a government official, a former government official, or they are getting money from the government. There is no real independent civil society that is allowed to comment publicly on foreign policy in the United States. That is the structural problem. And so foreign policy does not change. I mean, we have a new president, Obama, you know. The people elected him because they wanted change. And in the foreign policy towards Latin America has not changed at all under Obama. It is maybe a little bit worse than it was under Bush. And I say this objectively, you know, because I voted for Obama, and I am glad that he won as opposed to the right. But nonetheless, they are still, they are pursuing what you mentioned, a Cold War strategy toward Latin America. They look at Latin America in straight power terms. How can we win back what we lost when people democratically elected governments that wanted to be more independent? They look at it as, how do we win that? How do we get those countries back under our control? That is really the way they look at it. It's very simple and very wrong.
Mark Weinsbrot, le agradecemos mucho que haya concedido esta entrevista para la TV de las Madres y bueno, le deseamos una buena estancia en nuestro país.
Muchas gracias.
Adiós y gracias. Nosotros seguimos con esta serie de entrevistas. Le agradecemos también a Jorge Marchini y nos volvemos a encontrar en una próxima edición.